the SEC, and FINRA's focus on Reg BI, the 2023 edition. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share the content along with today's conversation with you following today's session. As always, we welcome your engagement and questions throughout today's session. Please feel free to engage and send us your questions through the Zoom chat dialog box, and we'll take them up at the end of today's session. And as with many of you, some of us are working from our home offices, so you may hear some background noise from time to time, and we appreciate your understanding. Let's jump in. To get us started, I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, starting with David.
Thank you very much, Parm. My name is David Porteous. I'm a partner in the business litigation and investment management practices at Faegre Drinker in Chicago.
Thank you, David. Tom?
Hi, thank you, Parm, for the opportunity to be on the panel. My name is Tom Selman. I'm founder of Scopus Financial Group. We provide regulatory consulting to broker-dealers, investment advisors, trade associations in the financial services industry. For 23 years, I was a senior executive at FINRA.
Thank you, Tom. Mr. Wagner?
Thanks, Parham, and hi, everyone. I'm Ed Wagner, and I am Head of Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Oyster Consulting. Oyster provides consulting, outsourcing, and compliance software for broker-dealers, investment advisors, and funds. Like Tom, prior to joining Oyster, I was with FINRA. I was with FINRA for 22 years, and most recently I was the head of FINRA's Midwest region.
Thank you, Ed. Mr. Barnes?
Thanks, Parham, and good afternoon, everybody. Randy Barnes, Director of our Product Engineering here at InvestorCOM. And unlike Ed or Tom, I have not been part of FINRA. I spent 24 years in the wealth management fintech space.
Thank you, Randy. And I will be your MC or moderator for today's conversation. As you can tell, my name is Parham Nasseri, and I wear the regulatory strategy here at InvestorCOM, partly because I spent a little bit over a decade at a regulatory organization. At InvestorCOM, if you haven't come across InvestorCOM, we are a leading regulatory software provider for wealth managers across North America. Our award-winning platform is known for its intuitive solutions that help eliminate compliance risk for our clients. Now, let's begin. Over the course of the regulation best interest journey, we've been bringing together the wealth and compliance communities to really better understand how you and your peers are tackling these regulations. Prior to every session, we conduct a poll to have a better understanding of what you're observing in the marketplace. And so here we go. What are we seeing? We first asked, what is the biggest area of regulatory enforcement that you are expecting to see in the marketplace? And you guessed it, the majority of you believe the assessment of reasonably available alternatives will be presenting an enforcement challenge for most. Others also thought this notion around account type recommendations, which we'll talk plenty about today, and rollover recommendations will present an enforcement challenge for you. So given this potential enforcement backdrop, we also asked, how are you today making best interest product, rollover, or account type recommendations or analyses? And as you can see on screen, it is fairly evident that today, the greater majority have somewhat of a manual process, whether that's a PDF fillable form or an Excel worksheet that's taking place. Having said that, on the right-hand side, you're seeing some of your peers starting to leverage technology, mostly on the rollover side of things. All right. We also asked, naturally, why are you not adopting technology to address some of the manual processes that we just talked about? And again, you guessed it, there is always the limited time and resources. That's plenty for firms, and always traditionally relying on PDF forms that we've uncovered today as well. Now, one of the main points called out during the recent SEC risk alert, which we'll talk about today as well, is how will you be able to illustrate compliance with your policies and procedures if you're not requiring documentation of the best interest analysis process, whether that's product recommendations, account type recommendations, or rollovers? And we asked you about this question, and you said, well, most will be relying on the financial professionals or the advisors to self-attest that they're making best interest recommendations, while others, as you can see, 38% are leveraging technology to capture the documentations. So this is very consistent with what we are seeing, InvestorCOM is seeing in the marketplace across our client base and prospects as well, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. As always, folks, this is a jam-packed agenda, so we will be going fast. We invite you to send in your questions to the chat dialog box, and we'll tackle them throughout today's session. So on the agenda today, we'll begin the conversation with an overview of the SEC and FINRA's recent focus on the CARE obligation. We'll then dive into how technology can be leveraged to meet the heightened regulatory expectations, including reasonably available alternatives, record keeping and supervisory requirements. And finally, we'll spend some time focused on what we've been hearing on the enforcement front, what you can expect on the horizon when it comes to regulatory expectations, including the retrospective review requirements. So with the poll results in mind, let's begin the conversation. David, if it's okay, I'll point to you first. The notice of let me just fast forward to the next slide. The SEC notice around account type recommendations that dates back to March of 2022 sets clear expectations around what the SEC at least is expecting around account type recommendations, specifically for duly registered advisors. In your humble opinion, what's the SEC's intention with respect to this particular bulletin?
My opinion isn't humble, but I will provide it nonetheless, which is this is foundational both to the establishment of the account relationship, but it's a decision tree regarding the economics of the account that you're going to have. So irrespective of the products and the reasonably available alternatives therein, at the end of the day, an account type recommendation is a type of product. And so whether the product and services that are going to accompany it are brokerage, and those services are priced in a different way than advisory services, they're saying, look, that's no different in the decision tree analysis than when you're making other types of recommendations of a specific product. So they need to be filtered through the same reasonably available alternative style analysis. How did you arrive at the decision to recommend that this person should have a brokerage account versus an advisory account? And I think more importantly, as is often the case, you may be dealing with a host of accounts that are coming over with one client or a family. So how did you parse between them? And so I think in the context of a dual IABD, obviously those systems are need to be substantial in evaluating that in the context of an IA or a BD. So kind of moving beyond BI, just looking at from purely advisory standpoint, you still have to be looking at this as how did I, as a pure RIA, make this recommendation that this person should be transitioning from a brokerage to an advisory account. As to the rollover piece, I think the experience last year with PTE 2020-02 reinforces that cost and economic decision is, since it's irreversible in terms of coming out of a plan into an IRA, is something that has to be taken equally seriously, and then likewise the documentation around that decision making recommendation.
Thanks, Dave. And maybe we can kind of transition or sort of look a little bit deeper into the sets of requirements that came out. What was surprising to me, at least, Ed, was the specific call out that the SEC expects financial professionals to assess reasonably available alternatives when it comes to that account type recommendation. What do you make of this?
No, you're exactly right, Param. I think that there may have been a perception that the reasonably available alternatives requirement really only applied to product recommendations. And like David mentioned, while it does apply to product recommendations, the SEC was clear in their bulletin that they believe that both broker-dealers under the requirements under Reg BI and investment advisors under their fiduciary obligations are also required to consider reasonably available alternatives when making account type recommendations. So when recommending account types, firms need to make sure that the account types that they're recommending are go through a best interest evaluation, which considers the spectrum of account types that are offered by the firm. And while the SEC was specific that firms only need to consider those account types that the firm offers, they did say that having a limited menu of account types or limitations due to things like licensings aren't going to justify recommending an account type that's not in a customer's best interest. So in the bulletin, they outline a number of types of things that they expect that firms will consider when assessing the different available alternatives with regard to account types. Customer-specific type factors like a customer's financial situation, their needs, their objectives and goals, as well as specific account type factors like costs, the services and products that are offered within the account type, the different types of account types that are available. And so my takeaway, having reviewed that, is that firms really need to make sure when they're assessing their procedures for account type recommendations that they're ensuring that they have a process for evaluating and considering the reasonably available alternative account types as part of that process. And that includes providing training to the reps and advisors in terms of how they should do that analysis between account types, and then also making sure that the reps and advisors have access to the available information that they need to assess the different account types against the customer's needs and objectives, and make sure that the recommendations that they're making with respect to the account type is in a customer's best interest.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Ed. And I think, you know, foundationally, or maybe principally, this sort of dives into another question that maybe, Tom, I can ask you around this blurring of the lines around regulatory expectations between advisors and broker-dealers, sales practices. What do you make of that?
Well, you're right, Parham. The staff bulletin does blur the lines between the fiduciary requirements for an investment advisor and Reg BI. The staff bulletin says that although Reg BI and the investment advisor's fiduciary duty are applied differently in some ways, quote, they generally yield substantially similar results in terms of the ultimate responsibilities owed to retail investors. And I have 3 points about that statement, about this blurring of the line between the fiduciary standard and Reg BI. First, it's really not a surprise. Before the adoption of Reg BI, regulators were faced with a nagging difference between the fiduciary duty for investment advisors and the suitability rule that applied to broker-dealers. And the differences were made more complicated by the fact that over time, more and more broker-dealer reps were associated with an investment advisor and vice versa. Today, about 85% of all advisor reps are also registered reps of a broker-dealer. So when you have different standards that are applied to the same person based on very similar types of recommendations, it becomes pretty difficult for a regulator to deal with. And the whole point, or one of the main points of Reg BI, was to try to resolve these disparities and bring those standards closer together. So this blurring shouldn't really surprise us, although I think it's the first time the SEC staff has said that so boldly. My second point is that the statement, I think, confirms what I felt and others have felt for a long time, which is that the SEC will not amend Reg BI anytime soon. Folks, particularly on the investment advisor side, who are aficionados of the fiduciary duty, would argue that, well, Reg BI just falls short of the fiduciary standard. It's really not as good. I think by saying this, the staff acknowledges that the standards yield similar results. In fact, that is what they said. And therefore, there's really no reason for the SEC to undertake a significant revision of Reg BI. The third point, which is the practical point I wanted to make, is that I think the principles of the fiduciary standard should be considered when you develop and manage your Reg BI compliance systems. And similarly, the principles under Reg BI you should consider when you're developing and managing your fiduciary systems for investment advisor. I'm assuming you're a duly registered firm. Many firms are duly registered, and I advise these firms to essentially build the chassis of your compliance system on Reg BI and the FINRA rules, because they're much more specific concerning the regulators' expectations. And then on that chassis for the investment advisor side, add whatever remaining issues there are that are specific to the fiduciary duty for investment advisors. And there shouldn't be a lot if we're talking about, the sales process and the recommendation to customers. They're so similar. So I think it's much easier to begin with the specificity of Reg BI and the FINRA rules, and then branch onto that and build onto that the additional requirements that might pertain to the fiduciary standard.
Thank you, Tom. Those are 3 excellent points. We'll be sure to tweet them in no time. Randy, maybe I can sort of shift the mic to you. Obviously, we heard about the account type recommendation questions from our clients prior to the SEC bulletin in March of 2022. I'm wondering if you can share, just broadly speaking, some of the thoughts behind what we heard and the questions that our clients were hearing from regulators, I should say, during those examinations.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is that at the time we heard it, based on the webinar poll, these guys were a little bit ahead of the curve. They're coming to us at that time saying, hey, this is great. We can talk about the product side of the recommendations, but what do you have for account type? We're in the middle of an exam and they're asking us about this type of a thing, even at that point. So I think it was good, to have that insight. Really what it's allowed us to do is dig in and, have conversations with the likes of Ed and David and Tom and try to navigate the rabbit holes, so to speak, get some information from all the clients we're talking to and see how they're looking at this, how they're doing it today, and try to build this framework. And I think Ed categorized it really well, the similar of cost and features and client needs or client demands at the time of this point in their financial journey. That's all got to come together in this analysis, and trying to navigate those rabbit holes, is something that we really got started on because of those initial conversations.
Thanks, Randy. And so what we've sort of put on the screen here is that framework of assessing alternatives across account types, across product types, and then making sure that there is that disclosure engine behind it, documentation engine behind those analyses. Maybe I can sort of shift to, or maybe fast forward time to FINRA's 2023 report around their examination findings of risk monitoring program. And Ed, do you see any major differences between what the SEC is highlighting, what SEC has highlighted in the past, and FINRA's expectations around rollovers and account type recommendations?
It's a good question, Param, and I think fits in line with what everybody's been saying in terms of what the expectations are that the regulators have between broker-dealers and investment advisors, and the different expectations between how the SEC views broker-dealers and FINRA views broker-dealers. But when it comes to Reg BI and all of the guidance that's been put out since it's been implemented, that's one of the things I've been looking at is, are there any differences or material different approaches in terms of how they're looking at it? And I haven't seen any real material differences, and I think that's really by design. While the suitability rule was FINRA's rule, FINRA has been very clear that because Reg BI is the SEC's rule, that while FINRA is responsible for examining for compliance and enforcing Reg BI requirements, they're deferring to the SEC in terms of policy, guidance, interpretations. And therefore, it appears that they're coordinating very closely with the SEC. They've in their public comments, they said that they've been very they've been working very closely with the SEC, both in terms of the things that they're reviewing for during examinations, the approaches that they're taking with respect to how they're examining for those things. And then as now they're getting to the point where they're seeing findings, the guidance that they're providing, as well as how they're enforcing the requirements in terms of enforcement actions. I'm sure that there's a lot of coordination between the SEC and with FINRA. Also importantly, it's important to remember that FINRA is subject to SEC oversight, and SEC regularly conducts reviews of FINRA's exam and enforcement program. So I'm sure that FINRA is careful to make sure that they're meeting the SEC's expectations when it comes to the reviews that they do for Reg BI, just to make sure that when they are examined by the SEC, that they don't have any, that the SEC doesn't identify any material concerns. So in looking at the SEC's bulletin in terms of the areas that they highlighted as factors that firms should consider when looking at things like rollovers, for example, where they talk about things like costs and available services, features, investment options, penalty-free withdrawals, the impact on minimum distributions, protections for creditors, things like that. And then looking at FINRA's exam and risk monitoring report, they're virtually identical with respect to rollovers. And I think, interestingly, too, in the SEC's bulletin, they refer to the DOL's PTE requirements. So I'm sure that they're wanting to be as consistent as possible across regulators, which is good for the industry because you don't, to the extent that you can, avoid major differences between what those expectations are. But the same thing applies with regard to account type recommendations under Reg BI. The considerations that were identified both by FINRA and the SEC were nearly identical, and were all the things that we talked about earlier. So my takeaway from this is that I think it still is important to stay abreast of all the communications that the different regulators have with respect to these areas, but that I would expect that you're not going to see significant differences between how they're approaching these things, largely because the FINRA looks to the SEC because it's their rule.
Got it. Thank you, Ed, for that insight. Now, Tom, quite often from our clients, we get this question of, well, how do you even assess costs and reasonably available alternatives broadly and consistently, specifically when it comes to product type recommendations? I asked you this theoretically earlier, but what's the intended purpose of this comparative exercise? What's the insight that comes to light between comparing reasonably available alternatives as part of that best interest analysis?
Well, as a survey indicated, I think this is an area people are most concerned about. And frankly, it's one that I've been most concerned about from the beginning, because I wasn't sure exactly how the staff would interpret the requirement. Reg BI is always required consideration of reasonably available alternatives. I think the purpose is to make sure that best interest is really treated as best interest, that if there's a product that's more appropriate for the customer because of costs or the operation of the product, that is the one that would be considered a reasonably available alternative that should be recommended. The requirement's obviously most important for complex products. When a simpler product, more straightforward product might do just as well for the purposes, then the firm and the rep are going to have to justify why they recommended a complex product. It would also, of course, as you indicated, be relevant for costly products, even if they're not complex. If it's a high load, high commission product, and there's one that is more affordable, which reaches the same objectives, then that has to be considered, and in some cases will need to be recommended, or at least the firm and the rep would have to defend the reason why they didn't recommend it. There are also two other points I made, one of which Ed kind of alluded to earlier. We did wonder at times whether the SEC or FINRA would ever say that the rep has to consider products that the firm doesn't offer. Just like with the account recommendations, the Reg BI statements from the SEC staff and FINRA staff have including the risk monitoring report, have pretty consistently referred to products that the firm offers. So there doesn't seem to be any requirement, and there wasn't one in the adopting release either, any requirement that you go outside what your firm offers and consider other products. At the same time, as Ed mentioned earlier, with respect to the account recommendations, the fact that a firm doesn't offer a product that's a good alternative doesn't mean that the recommendation of, say, a complex product is in the best interest of the customer. You still have to analyze the appropriateness of that product for that particular customer. And then the second point I want to make is that FINRA and the SEC increasingly require documentation of how the reasonably available alternative was considered. I think this is, if there's one thing I can think of that's most significant that under Chair Gensler, the staff added to the previous interpretations of Reg BI. I think it's just the specificity of the documentation. And I may get into this with a case that they filed a bit later. Basically, you know, if a rep says after the fact that they consider reasonably available alternative, and that's all they did, they just assert that they did it, that they considered it, that's not going to be enough. There has to be documentation of what was considered. And moreover, FINRA makes clear in the risk monitoring report that the firm has to train the reps on how they're supposed to consider reasonably available alternatives. What kind of considerations do they make? What steps should they go through in making this consideration? I should also say the SEC staff bulletin also makes that same point. So I think documentation is increasingly important.
Could not agree with you more, Tom. And we get that question quite often. And the risk area that's created by just that self-attestation or asserting that yeah, I've considered alternatives. Well, I think it misses the mark in terms of course, you've considered alternatives. What were they? How is your recommendation much more beneficial to the investor compared to other recommendations? So let me switch the topic of conversation a little bit to Randy, and you know, maybe as someone who's interacting you know, with our clients who have been looking to adopt some of these technology solutions, what are you seeing today, and how do you think our workflows can help today?
Yeah, I think there's probably, I'm going to call it four points that seem to keep popping up a lot in our conversations. One is just around when is this documentation, when does this recommendation need to be done? You know, I think largely we're seeing a lot of times it's part of the trade flow, or part of the new account opening, or, you know, part of, you know, the transaction itself, which doesn't necessarily allow itself to have a recommendation analysis that yields an answer that, like, this may not be in the client's best interest to do what you think you're trying to do. And so taking that step back, and, you know, the recommendation could be do nothing potentially, you know, having the right framework around that is a big one. Another component of the when is making it compulsory or not. You know, how are you deciding when this is going to be done at that operational type of a decision, and how are you justifying that, documenting it in your policies and procedures? And then I think the worst part is how are you able to enforce that and supervise and monitor that? So if it's not, you know, as compulsory or 100% as possible, that's going to be a challenge. Another big point, you know, we keep hearing that all these regulatory acts and movements just keep piling more and more onto the financial professional, onto the front office. So how can we make this be the least impactful to the field and easier to adopt? So, you know, think intuitive technology, intuitive user integration, kind of end to end as much as possible. But you know, just we need to make sure that that this is as frictionless as it can be as an industry, so that, you know, these guys aren't wrapped around the axle too much on that. Third, I would say is how can I apply my specific business to whatever technology I'm adopting, right? whether I'm building it internally, whether I'm, we're talking to a vendor or, some sort of other solution. How can I make sure that it's applicable to me and how I run my business and how I need to manage? So that level of configurability, call it customization, call it whatever you like, but I need to put my stamp on it. So how do I do that? And then the fourth big one is efficiently being able to store the artifacts that are put together so that when I do get called on the carpet and I need to produce something, I'm not running all over God's green earth to try to find it. I'm not putting a call into a branch office 4 states away and hope that somebody picks up the phone so that they can shoot me a copy of the artifact that was done 3 months ago, right? Having access to that easily is paramount, I think, for making this a seamless process.
Thanks, Randy. And maybe thanks for sharing the insights from what we're hearing from our clients. Maybe let's sort of flip the page. And, the one of the latest alerts was the SEC's risk alert as it pertains to Reg BI. And there was quite a few deficiencies that were at least, alarming to me personally when they listed them out. Ed, maybe I can ask you quickly, the Jan 30th Reg BI risk alert makes a few concrete compliance deficiencies, or at least calls them out. From your perspective, what really stands out?
Thanks, Parham. I did think that the risk alert was very informative. And I think all of these pieces of guidance that the regulators have been issuing lately have been really informative, especially, when firms are trying to apply these rules in their day-to-day activities. And, one of the questions that we get asked most often are, what are the regulators' expectations and what are other firms doing? And I think through these types of documents, it really kind of gives you an insight both in terms of what they're looking for and a little more detail around that, and also what they're finding at peer firms. So I think these are great tools for firms to use to assess their own programs. And the nice thing is you can do that before the regulators come and find similar things at your firm. I did like how FINRA outlined their report now in terms of identifying the considerations that they expect you to be making, the common findings that they're seeing on the examinations, and then also, and importantly, effective practices. While those effective practices aren't necessarily obligations or things that they've seen other firms do that they found to be effective. So those are really informative as well. And specifically with respect to the risk alert, like we've been saying, it's not very different than what we're seeing in other pieces of guidance across the regulators. But I thought it was really informative in terms of really what the SEC's expectations are here, specifically with respect to the compliance requirements for the care obligation. They had mentioned that as time went on, the examinations were going to start looking more and more substantively at the implementation of the requirements, and specifically with regard to the care obligation. So these things I thought were really enlightening. They found in some cases that while firms had procedures that addressed reasonably available alternatives and cost considerations, they felt like oftentimes those firms didn't provide guidance for the representatives and the advisors in terms of how to do those assessments, how to consider costs. So it's important that firms' procedures and training cover those, so that not only are you having a requirement, but you're also providing support so that it can be done. Another interesting point is that they found that firms created systems that help them evaluate costs and alternatives, but didn't mandate their use. So, it kind of gets to some of the things that we were talking about, the poll questions about whether you're doing things manually, whether you're doing things on an automated basis. And then I guess another good question would be to ask is if you have an automated solution for this, are you mandating that across your reps? Because what they did find is that in situations where firms didn't have technology or had technology but weren't necessarily mandating their use, they found that firms were struggling to enforce their procedures in a consistent way. And another thing they found was that, and we've talked a lot about documentation, that firms were requiring documentation with respect to the basis for recommendations, but didn't instruct reps and advisors on when it was necessary and appropriate, and the specific information that they expected to be gathered. So it's important when looking at your procedures, making sure that you're clear on when you need to have documentation, when you expect documentation, and the types of things that need to be gathered, and make sure that that's part of your training as well. The other thing that I found interesting was the discussion that they had with respect to, which I think was around manual compliance with this. If they had a decentralized system and the expectation was that advisors and reps in the field were capturing this information, but they were capturing it and keeping it in their branch offices, that it put firms at a disadvantage in that they could only really for compliance when doing things like branch office reviews. And so, you know, it's another thing. If you do have a manual system, you need to consider how you can assess the overall effectiveness of your program on a regular basis if the information is being captured and stored in remote locations and you don't have access to that centrally. So I would say the takeaway from this is to use the risk alert, use FINRA's report, and other guidance that you come across to assess your policies and procedures against these things that they're finding, to see if they were to look at these areas at your firm, would they have similar findings. But it's also, you know, good to talk to your peers and see what they're doing in these regards, or talk to consultants or other advisors just to see what they're saying, what other firms might be doing, and what some effective practices are.
Thank you, Ed. You mentioned a couple of things that sort of piqued my interest around, and we hear about this all the time, right? Implement a system. As a technology vendor, we support our firms, and they implement a technology solution. We are not necessarily in a position to suggest, hey, make it mandatory across your client base. And maybe I can sort of ask you this question, Dave, because you know, if a system's implemented, but as actually the SEC risk alert calls out as a deficiency, if a system is implemented, but you know the firm hasn't required documentation or made that system or the use of it compulsory, from your perspective as someone who practices litigation, does that expose the firm? What risks does that expose the firm to?
To the extent that the firm's implementation of Reg BI and its own assessment of risk was to say, look, it's going to be easier for us to do this on a compulsory basis for all recommendations. We're not going to differentiate between costly products, complex products, risk, you know, a risk-based system. We're just going to do it prophylactically, and then you don't follow your own policies and procedures, then you're going to be subject to, you know, failure to supervise for failure to follow your own policies and procedures. But I think that the broader issue here, and a couple of takeaways from the SEC's risk alert, is the documentation requirement is the culmination of a lot of the rest of Reg BI's implementation, right? Whether it's the compliance obligation, the conflict obligation, or the care obligation, to the extent that you don't have adequate policies and procedures, you don't have adequate training, you don't give people a lot of guidance, you know, they're going to see the output of those deficiencies in the inadequacy of your record keeping on the document side. Now, that it isn't to say that you have to document everything. They were clear that it's risk-based. And I think, as Tom pointed out, you know, we're expecting to see documentation, particularly around costly products and complex products. And they used as examples variable annuities, which they've been on a warpath about for some time. But, you know, I think what we do see in exams is it may not be focused per se on a particular class of product, although certainly focusing on products that have more nuanced cost structures are ripe for focusing on for purposes of reasonably available alternatives, saying, well, whether and to what extent did you explain these aspects and did you document this? But I think there are a couple of takeaways I see in this report, and I've seen in exams, which is, what is the most infrequent type of documentation that we can focus upon to determine whether or not you really get it? And by that, I mean, and they pointed this out, is we didn't see documentation of circumstances in which recommendations were rejected or not accepted by a retail customer. In other words, how frequently and how well is your system working is evaluated by determining the instances in which you denied or canceled or rejected a recommendation. Either the client did, and or we suggested something, or the client was asking for something and we overrode what the client was seeking because we just didn't think that was in their best interest. And that's the apex of saying that we get it by having some level of let's call it a rejection rate. I've had this discussion with examiners to say, well, look, the system isn't designed by which we should have an arguing like, you're telling us you only, had initial rejects before ultimately processing a different trade. So, your quote unquote cancellation rate was less than 1%. It's like, well, you're not understanding how the brokerage system operates. It's not designed to force product on people, but at the same time, if we're having a conversation and we think something may or may not work for them, and then we come back with something else, so ultimately we do a trade, it just is a different one, isn't that doing what the system's designed to do? But I think there's a lot of focus from examiners on this threshold issue of give us how many that you canceled or how many you rejected, because at least it demonstrates a sophistication of analysis that we ultimately determined something wasn't in the client's best interest, or the client rejected what we recommended, and what happened with that. So I think those are circumstances in which the documentation process comes into focus. And what the risk alert was really emphasizing is the documentation is the means by which we're trying to understand how you audited and tested the adequacy of the entire system. And so if you don't have any documentation, or because let's say you've done a risk-based analysis, you're not requiring it, it's not compulsory, but you guys are recommending mutual funds. Okay, are you saying all mutual funds or a single stock? By way of example, just because it's blue chip doesn't mean that you don't have to still think through what the alternatives might be. So I think it's focusing on documentation and looking at it from a perspective of what does it say about my system, and the less that you have to offer them, then the more they're going to find problems with other aspects of your Reg BI system as a whole. Why do you have so little documentation is probably because it could be any number of reasons, but among them would be we didn't train people very well, we didn't require them to have it, and they didn't understand what they're supposed to complete. And so invariably examiners are going to find a number of deficiencies with your system, not just your documentation.
Thank you, Dave. That's very, very clear and well said. I'm always shocked at how quickly time goes by when we have such fantastic panelists and opinions on this topic. Let me fast forward a bit and maybe, given our agenda, shift the conversation a little bit around the enforcement activities and observations we've had to date. Clearly there's been plenty of activity in the marketplace, and maybe, Tom, I can ask you this question. So far, there's been 2 specific enforcement cases directly relating to Reg BI, as far as I can tell. Any highlights that come to mind and you'd like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, well, Parma, I think I'd like to focus on one case in particular. It was the case that was filed by the SEC. It's just a complaint, hasn't gone beyond the complaint stage, but it was filed last June against Western International Securities. It's got a lot of interesting features to the complaint. I think for purposes of the discussion, and keep it short, the most significant is, again, a reference to documentation. We talked about documentation for this entire webinar, and the complaint indicates it as well, that the product at issue were these unusual corporate bonds that were being recommended. And according to the complaint, the reps who sold those corporate bonds didn't document why he believed that the bonds specifically were in the customer's best interest. So this isn't specifically the reasonably available alternatives issue, but it's it's obviously the larger issue of the best interest standard and the requirement by a rep to document specifically why a recommendation is in the customer's best interest, or why he chose to recommend that as opposed to other products that offered a higher yield. Also, the staff, again, I want to emphasize, I guess, because I think this may have come up in the questions, Reg BI does not specifically require documentation. So again, I think this is something that's been added by the staff, particularly under the Gensler administration. the emphasis on documentation. But I think the complaint indicates again that the documentation concerning the best interest standard, as well as the more specific reasonably available alternatives, is going to be important. Moreover, the complaint directly went after the rep's basis, the basis that the rep did document for why the bonds were in the best interest. And the complaint said that those reasons were unreasonable, vague, and generic. That again, there was some minor documentation of the best interest standard, but it was way too vague. So it has to be very specific, very detailed, something that can be cited later after the fact, say in litigation, and everyone would understand what the rep was actually thinking at the time of the recommendation. It's a pretty heavy burden actually for a compliance system.
Thank you, Tom. And just so we can kind of get to our audience questions that have been trickling in, and for those who haven't, please submit them. We've got plenty of time to tackle them. One last quick question for you, Dave. Obviously, with Reg BI enforcement being a hot topic and catching headlines, many are expecting the enforcement activity to ramp up over the coming months. Again, as someone who's in this particular practice, how do you believe firms and financial professionals can mitigate the potential of enforcement activity against them?
Right, and you know, if we follow the timeline of both the risk alerts and then early enforcement cases, a number of which were focused on Form CRS and the timely delivery of these issues, I think they go to the broader concepts that we've been having as a whole, which is the front line of the defense is obviously the adequacy of your systems and processes. But if let's say you're going through and have already been through an exam, you've got some deficiencies, but you came out the other side that didn't result in an enforcement action, like any regulatory deficiency, you don't want them coming back again and finding this issue or a collateral issue related to it still defective. So I think it's taking the lessons learned from your own exams, let alone looking at these risk alerts and saying, okay, what I see a lot of firms do is they'll take some of these risk alerts and saying, how if at all is this applicable to us, some of these issues, running that against our annual review, looking at our gap list and our checklist and saying, to what extent are there some areas here that we could improve upon? So just by way of example, Ed, I think you mentioned it, that a lot of firms were doing manual, maintaining documents in a decentralized fashion, so that it was impairing the quality of firms' audit, compliance, and testing processes. All of that kind of rolls itself forward to saying, I don't really know the answers when the examiners ask me these issues, is more likely than not going to result in at least a scorching deficiency letter, if not a referral to enforcement. So at the end of the day, it's taking the lessons learned or the bruises that you observe others are enduring and saying, how if at all does this apply to our systems? Because we don't have to have every bell and whistle that everybody has. But at the same time, are there some lessons that you learned here when the SEC says, look, we're seeing very generalized Reg BI policies and we're seeing inadequate documentation? At least that's a word to the wise, because I've had exams and enforcement actions where they start quoting to you like, we warned you, it was in this risk alert, that was a year ago, and so it should come as no surprise that we're focused on the inadequacies here and you didn't seem to have done anything about it. So I think that's kind of the front line, the fire line, so to speak, of building a defense, is the offense of taking advantage of these alerts and saying, how do they apply to us, and shoring some of them up as reasonably available cost alternatives of fixing your systems.
And one thing I would add in terms of enforcement actions coming is and I think you've seen it with respect to FINRA's cases that they brought with respect to excessive trading. I think Reg BI provided some new tools that the regulators didn't have in the past, and that allow them to get at issues that they had wanted to get at before but couldn't under suitability. So for example, like things like excessive trading, where they had to prove a pretty high test of de facto control in those cases. Now with Reg BI taking that requirement away, it provides the regulators with the tools that they need in order to bring those cases more effectively. So I think you're going to see more of those types of cases coming out.
Amazing insights. Thank you, folks, for your thoughtful comments. I'm going to do a quick blurb before jumping into the audience's questions, which are trickling in. Randy touched on this, but as a firm, we've been helping over 30 firms now meet these regulatory requirements with confidence. And as the poll results indicated, more than 50% of firms are relying on manual processes to make those best interest recommendations. If that's the case and you're pondering how to eliminate compliance risk or mitigate some of those risks, let us know. InvestorCOM.com/go digital. We would love to show you some of the best practices we've garnered helping your peers in the industry. With that said, let me shift over to our lightning round questions. Give me a second. I need to pull up the questions that have been put together from the audience today, and let's jump into it. And maybe Dave, there's a follow-up to one of your questions. I'll just jump into that. Any idea of best practices for rejecting or potentially reject rate percentages of overall recommendations?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an elusive construct, as I was explaining in the case I had with enforcement staff where they were asking this issue. We had to explain to them that, look, you're supposed to enter orders as instructed by clients. If we've reached a point where we've made a recommendation, it's going to work itself through the system to the point that, well, yes, but we're trying to evaluate the circumstances in which you said, notwithstanding what the client wanted, we think that this was not in their best interest. Let's say it's a rollover. It's a good example of something where you can say, well, we talked with a prospective client and we declined, or we told them that we didn't think the rollover was in their best interest. You're going to see pretty low percentages because the system isn't designed. And when you're meeting with clients, it should be such that you're able to convey that, look, 1% or even less than 1% of our transactions are quote unquote canceled, as compared to if there's a reject for some reason and we went back to the client and said, look, we told the rep we didn't think this transaction was suitable for the client or not in the best interest. Go back and talk to the client. Let's figure out what may be better for them. And so it's a bit of a misnomer to say, or how do you account for a transaction in which there's a reject, but it ends up getting processed with a different transaction. So, and I think that's important to try and embrace that, but at least saying, look, it may not occur frequently, but we do identify the circumstances in which a transaction gets routed back. We wouldn't call it a cancel or a reject. We just say, we told the advisor that this wasn't going to cut it, or the advisor told the client that we didn't think this was in their best interest. What else? Let's sit back down and come up with something better. And I think it's really tracking that system and evaluating the frequency with which that happens, and just having those numbers available to the extent you can track it, so that you can explain that system to an examiner, say it's not just a binary number of how many cancels we had.
Yeah, David, I don't know if you would agree, but this thing doesn't really make that much sense, because first of all, if it's the customer wanting to do a self-directed trade and you're supposed to, the staff expects you to note that we disagreed with the customer. Well, like you said, it shouldn't come up very often because these are not self-directed accounts.
Right.
They're full service brokerage relationship. If they're talking about instead the situation in which the rep recommended something and the firm's compliance or the principal said, no, we don't think that's in their best interest, you really don't want to have too many of those. Because if there are too many of those, then it means you're not training the reps right.
Right.
So it's like the whole thing is a no-win.
Yeah, right. It's a no-win answer, but I think at least saying, look, here's our system in terms of how we process our review for recommended transactions.
Yeah.
But we'll give you examples in which a trade got round tripped in terms of it was initially rejected for some reason, but then it got rebooked. Maybe a different alternative or something like that. Instead of citing those examples to say, yeah, we have instances in which we didn't like the alternative that was initially offered or the client didn't, but and we've tracked that. So I think trying to get some tracking around that system gives you more credit than the binary proposition of tell me how many trades canceled.
Right.
This is such a clever point, and it's an important one. And we come across this all the time with our clients because there is foundationally a difference between a recommendation and an executed transaction. And I think to be able to determine between those two optionalities, you do need to have all the recommendations evidence. So, which is kind of part of the reason we're getting into this conversation. There's plenty of questions here that we probably won't have time to address in the next 4 minutes. I can self-attest that we'll get back to you individually with respect to these questions that are popped up here, but maybe a couple more questions just in the interest of time. There is a lot of questions around the depth of documentation, so I'm going to combine a few questions, whether a canned justification is going to be enough versus adding additional context around the recommendation around why is this in the investor's best interest. How much detail is enough when it comes to this new post-Reg BI regime world?
If I can throw out a quick answer, and I don't mean to jump ahead of others, a thought occurred to me because I've had this conversation with some clients in which, let's go to the pre-Reg BI world, where you'd often see in the text field, it would say, this is what the client wants, so it's a good idea. And that's the justification. And I think what BI turns it around saying it does matter what the client wants. It helped direct you to an idea of what you were trying to accomplish for them. But is this really in their best interest? So what's your subjective view as to what's appropriate? And I think that is the nuance. Can you do a checkbox approach to achieve that? Yes, it just requires more boxes to achieve a level of subjective analysis that says we considered these factors. We see this a lot with firms and their like account rollover, account type or rollover analysis that you can have 5 or 6 different factors, all of which could be checked. So it's reducible to some check boxes, but you're going to need more boxes.
You know, I think it's a risk-based. I think it's possible to have a system that requires more detail for certain transactions. Again, you know, rollovers, complex transactions, costly products, unusual products. If you're recommending a mutual fund that the customer already owns, you know, probably you don't need as much detail, I would think. But you've got to have enough detail that you can understand it after the fact.
I think that's the critical point is like they said in the guidance, the rule is that the documentation for the basis for the recommendations isn't technically required, but it should be in certain cases, and it's risk-based and all of that. But at the end of the day, that documentation is meant to support the recommendations that you're making when viewed in retrospect by an examiner who comes in. So in terms of the level of depth, I would say the level of depth that you feel comfortable that you'd be able to justify the recommendation if asked.
Excellent remarks. Maybe time for one more question. Do you have any observations regarding documentation of recommendations made to prospective clients that are ultimately not followed? The underscoring of the not followed. Does that matter if it's followed or not followed?
Maybe I'll start. I think the fact that a recommendation was made means that you have to do the assessment of whether that recommendation is in the customer's best interest, right? And then the question of documentation really hinges on the factors associated with it. Like we were talking about the complex nature of the product, the costs involved, and things like that. So I would probably do the same assessment for those that, you know, recommendations that are made that aren't followed. I think there's less of a risk there because if a client didn't follow it, you know, there's no potential that the client's going to be harmed by the recommendation that you made. So it's a tricky question, but I'll leave it.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think of a good surveillance program, and you know, we have to be practical. So what I'm about to say is not too practical. But when I think of a surveillance program, I would want to know every time a rep recommends, say, a leverage or inverse ETF, or a complex product that's unusual, an L bond in the case that the SEC brought. just to know what they're recommending, even if it doesn't go through. So there are certain situations in which I might say to the reps, I don't care whether it goes through or not. If you're going to recommend X product, we want a record of it. And if you don't do it, then, you know, we're going to sanction you.
Folks, we spent over 60 minutes together. Amazing how time flies when you've got such an interesting topic and incredible panelists to share their insights. Thank you all for your time. We will follow up with those who asked questions, and have yourselves a great day.